I just want to say really quick, I'm going to do humorist. Uh, something really funny just came to me. All right. So I'll cover that later. All right. All right. Intro. 1840 to 1850, known as the Hungry 40s. This morning, John will be laying down some history for you. Hopefully, you will learn about this wild time in history. Please help me welcome John with speech 3 from the Strategic Relationships Path, researching and presenting the Hungry 40s. Woo.
When was the last time you were really hungry? Like, not get a little rumble in your tummy, not, man, I haven't eaten lunch, but really hungry. Like, haven't eaten in days hungry. I was trying to think back on that. I don't remember when. I've missed more than maybe 2 meals. I've been extremely fortunate in my life. And that's not the normal case for most of people in world history. Now, I'm going to talk today about one specific time that sparked a lot of the change that we are dealing with now. And that is the Hungry 40s, the 1840s. If you think back, I think there's one thing that most people in Western civilization it's a memory trigger, the potato famine. Everybody heard of the potato famine before? A little bit? Yeah. So that triggered the Irish diaspora. There we go. Irish diaspora, where you had over 1 million people in Ireland starve to death. And then you had at least 2.5 to 3 million people emigrate from that little tiny country to the rest of the world. Anywhere there was work, anywhere they could get away to, they did. Now, that's the one that kind of gets told a lot about in America, because many of those Irish traveled to America. Some of those Irish were my family. And with that, you don't hear about the rest of Europe. Potatoes were brought over from the Peruvian region of South America because they were, and still are, extremely well grown there. There's like 1,000 plus varieties of potato, but only like 4 or 5 were brought to Europe. These 4 or 5 were hearty, good potatoes. It provided a very cheap source of food for a lot of people. I'm pulling this research from a couple different books that I've read over the years, but also most recently from Mike Duncan's Revolutions podcast. If you are into history and want to get into the nitty-gritty details on some really cool stuff, I highly recommend it. And I'm sending in the chat right now, I'm sending a link to his feeds. And I've gone through a lot of the different civil wars and revolutions that he's been covering. But right now I'm talking about the 1840s, when the entire Western hemisphere blew up. So you have this potato famine because you only have 5 varieties of potatoes-ish. If you get blight, which happened, it makes the potatoes turn to basically mashed potatoes and rot when they're trying to be stored. So you had a huge proportion of the population relying on these as their primary source of food. Imagine if you have one crop that you're relying on and then that crop fails. Now, Ireland is a subset because in Ireland, they still were exporting food during this time when millions of people were starving, because you had people growing other food and they needed to make money. So they were sending it off, and they were restricting anybody who couldn't afford it from having it. And that's why the British get a very, very bad rap in Ireland, and one of the many, many atrocities that happened there. But through the rest of Europe, you had the potato famine hit too. So you had hundreds of thousands of people dying of starvation because they couldn't afford more than potatoes. Now this hit, it's like a perfect cascading tidal wave, because at the same time you had this giant population explosion just before this happened. You had semi-stable Europe after the Napoleonic Wars. You had all of new technology and medicine were being developed after all of that battlefield stuff. People were starting to figure out about diseases, and nutrition got a little bit better. So you had this population boom at the same time as you had the Industrial Revolution hitting. So you had a lot of people going from an agricultural based practice into city jobs and working in factories. You had this mass production going on where you had all of these artisans being put out of work because if you were a potter, say, and they could make pots 10-fold faster and 1/10 the price, you were getting put out of work. These are all, so you basically had a lot of people that were very hungry already. And then you had a potato famine hit. So kind of like what we have right now in 2020, where we have a lot of homeless, a lot of houseless folks that are all over the place. That's what was happening in the 1840s. So you had the potatoes fail. You had massive increases in the price of goods. You had people who were upper middle class and the super wealthy. They were eating fine. They were paying more, but they could afford it. And a lot of other people couldn't. A lot of other people couldn't. So you had riots. You had all sorts of government assistance happening in all of these different countries. You had all of these countries that had just gotten out of war. They were in debt already, and they started trying to do supplemental bread programs, food programs to try to make sure that these people were fed. Not enough. Too little, too late. So you had all of this boiling over at the same time. And then you had a really bad a really bad wheat harvest and a barley harvest. So you had all three of these hit within a year. Then you also had the railroad boom. So just like we had in 2008 with the housing bubble, they had the same thing with a railroad bubble. Anybody could create a railroad company and investments were pouring in, but all of it was a shell game. So very similar to Enron and what happened there. So the railroads went bust. All of the public infrastructure went bust. All of the manufacturing jobs that were creating these railroad parts went bust. Not all, but a vast majority of them. Basically, you had this perfect storm of everything that could go wrong went wrong. Now, I want you to think back what happened 90 years after that. The 1930s, the Great Depression. What has happened 90 years after that? 2020, right now, and COVID. It's kind of weird how when you research history, there are some cycles that happen. I'm curious what we're going to have. I mean, we had the Arab Spring that just happened a little bit ago in our lifetimes. That was a drastic change. The 1840s brought about revolution on a wide scale, all the way through all around the world. We may be up for that right now too. So I want you to be thinking, when you know history, you can maybe figure out why things happened. And when you know history, maybe you can observe what's happening now in a different lens and with a different light. So I hope we are not in the middle of millions of people dying of plague. Wait, we are. I hope we are not in the middle of millions of people dying of starvation. Wait, we may be. Nature's metal. Nature's rough. And right now we're in the process of nature being really rough. So I hope you do your best to help alleviate these problems, but also be aware that we have it really good right now. And I hope that continues. Mr. Toastmaster.